just found it. Thank you.
Hi,
Hey,
Kramer.
Elizabeth Defeis.
Yeah, we've
Hello.
met before. Good to see you.
Yes.
Are the microphones working? Can you hear me? Fantastic. Greetings, everyone. We'll get started now. We have all our speakers here for this special event in the beginning of the Kennan Institute calendar year. This event, Separatism in Moldova, Political and Legal Aspects of a Frozen Conflict, is co-sponsored by the Moldova Foundation, the East European Studies, and the Kennan Institute, which is, I'm of the Kennan Institute, and of the Woodrow Wilson Center. So welcome everyone here today. This is going to be a packed program. So I'd like to start out by reading parts of the biographies of each of our speakers and our discussant. And then we will go person after person, and then there's going to be plenty of time, we hope, for interaction with the audience. Our first speaker today, and again, I received very rich biographies for each of these wonderful people who are with us today. I will have to truncate some of them, but know that there's a lot more to each of these people than I'm giving you. David Kramer is, since July 2005, David J. Kramer has been a Deputy Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, where he is responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus affairs, as well as regional non-proliferation issues. Previously, he served as a professional staff member in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. Before that, he served as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. He also was executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy in Washington. Before joining the government, he was a senior fellow at the Project for the New American Century, associate director of the Russian and Eurasian program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and assistant director of Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, all in Washington. Prior to moving to Washington, he was a lecturer in Russian Studies at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and a teaching fellow at Harvard University. He also served as an analyst for the Christian Science Monitor Network during the collapse of the Soviet Union. A native of Massachusetts, Kramer received his MA in Soviet Studies from Harvard University and his BA in Soviet Studies and Political Science from Tufts University. Moving on, Professor Elizabeth Defeis. Professor Defeis is a member of the International Law Faculty of Seton Hall University School of Law and had previously served as Dean of the Law School for 5 years. In addition to international law, Professor Defeis teaches international human rights, international criminal law, European Union law, as well as United States constitutional law. She was a visiting professor of law at the University of Milan and held a distinguished chair at the University of Naples pursuant to a Fulbright scholarship. In addition, through Fulbright scholarships, she has lectured at various universities, including those in India, Bangladesh, Egypt, and Armenia. She is also the recipient of several other awards and fellowships, including a Ford Foundation Fellowship and a Reginald Heber Smith Fellowship. Again, moving on, and I again apologize for the truncating as I have been. Christopher Borgen is an associate professor of law at St. John's University School of Law, where he teaches international law, national security in the law, and contracts. He received an A.B. cum laude from Harvard College in 1991 and a J.D. from New York University School of Law in 1995. He's the co-author with David Betterman of Emory University and David Martin of the University of Virginia of International Law, a Judge's Handbook, which was written under the auspices of the Judicial Outreach Program of the American Society of International Law and distributed to all federal district and appellate judges. He's also the editor and annotator of a forthcoming collection of speeches by justices of the U.S. Supreme Court on international legal topics. Next, we have Mark Meyer, who is widely recognized as one of America's leading international lawyers with a particular expertise in Southeast Europe. His primary focus is international joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions, privatizations, and international arbitrations for major U.S., European, and Israeli corporations engaged in manufacturing, energy, tourism, transportation, telecommunications, real estate development, and in capital-raising activities. He is a member of the panel of international arbitrators of the International Center for Dispute Resolution, the International Division of the American Arbitration Association, charged with the exclusive administration of all of the AAA's international matters, as well as the panel of Romanian Court of International Commercial Arbitration in Bucharest. He is a fellow of the American Bar Foundation of the American Bar Association, whose members are limited to 1/3 of all lawyers in each state and are elected in recognition of outstanding professional attainment. Finally, our discussant today will be Ambassador William Hill, who is currently an associate of Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. He returned this summer to Washington, D.C. after completing his second term from January 2003 to July 2006 as head of the OSCE mission to Moldova, where he was charged with negotiation of a political settlement to the Transnistrian conflict and facilitation of the withdrawal of Russian forces, arms, and ammunition from Moldova. He was a public policy scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. from November 2001 to September 2002, after his first tour as OSCE head of mission in Moldova. A career Foreign Service officer, he has served in Moscow, Leningrad, Belgrade, the U.S. CSCE delegation in Vienna and Dachau. In Washington, D.C., he has held a number of posts involving East-West relations, political military affairs, and intelligence analysis, including CSCE coordinator and chief of analysis for Eastern Europe in the State Department, European Division chief in the Voice of America, and senior advisor for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus in the Office of the Secretary of Defense of the Pentagon. It's quite a crowd we have up here and quite a discussion to get started. And so let's welcome David Kramer to open our conference with his remarks. David.
Let's see. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. And my thanks to the Moldova Foundation for organizing this event. Vlad, appreciate the invitation very much, and also your flexibility in scheduling this. The Kennan Institute, of course, Woodrow Wilson for hosting this event. Also, my thanks to my colleagues, both from the New York Bar and for the terrific report that you've done and produced. I think it's a very valuable contribution to looking at this issue. And I also want to give a special thanks to a colleague to my left, to Bill Hill, whom I have not known all that long, but I think I've gotten to know very well as a result of spending long hours, I guess it's fair to say, in negotiations on the 5+2. And in my mind, there is no more professional, no more dedicated public servant than Bill is, who has done a terrific job in trying to move this issue along. And so special thanks to you, Bill, because I know there have been some things written about you that haven't been so flattering, and they have been extraordinarily unjustified. Bill has done a terrific job in the positions he's held on this. Let me also acknowledge, by the way, the Ambassador Kitawaka, who has been here for about a month, I believe, almost to this day, right? And exactly. And we very warmly welcome you and are glad you're here, and believe you have been off to a very good, strong start. So pleased to have you, and thanks for coming. I'm delighted to see such a good turnout for a discussion of Moldova here, particularly on a Friday afternoon. And let me just very quickly lay out how the U.S. government sees the issue of Transnistria. Let me start by citing President Bush, who, when he met with Romanian President Basescu earlier this summer, stated that the United States seeks a resolution to the problem of Transnistria that fully and unequivocally respects Moldova's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The bottom line is that Transnistria, as far as we are concerned, is a part of Moldova. No further questions asked. And in our view, the fomenting of separatism, whether in Transnistria or elsewhere, is not acceptable. In addition, as part of this issue, we have felt that the fulfillment of Istanbul commitments by Russia is a very important part of the equation. I come today feeling cautiously optimistic about the situation, and I underscore the word cautiously. I think for several reasons, and let me lay them out. The U.S. and the EU were invited to join as observers in the negotiations in the fall of last year, and I think that has been a positive development, even though we have not had negotiations since February. In addition, we have seen the deployment by EU forces to monitor the border between Moldova and Ukraine, and that too, I think, has led to an improvement in the situation and to tighter border controls, which has been a very important part of this. On March 3rd, following an agreement signed last December, which confirmed an agreement signed back in 2003, Ukraine, in a very important development, implemented the customs agreement between it and Moldova. That, too, was also an extremely important development, which further lent strength to Moldova's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We have seen the registration of virtually all Transnistrian enterprises with authorities in Chisinau in virtual defiance of Mr. Smirnov in Tiraspol, who strongly urged them not to register with Moldovan authorities. I think we've also seen in other issues where Mr. Smirnov's sense of invincibility has been tarnished when he tried to restrict funding for NGOs. And so I think we have seen that there is less than meets the eye there. The farmers' dispute in Dubasari was resolved. This was an issue, as Bill and I remember very well, that the last round of negotiations broke up over. And to my surprise, I will admit, the sides worked out this issue, and they deserve credit for that, as does the OSCE for the role it played in that issue. A final point and final reason I would cite for my cautious optimism is that the issue of Moldova and Transnistria has been on the radar screen at high levels of our government, other governments, more than it's ever been before. At every political directors meeting of the G8, which I joined Nick Burns for all of them, the issue of Moldova came up at every meeting. At the G8 Foreign Ministers meeting, the Secretary Rice raised the issue of Moldova, Transnistria. And this issue, including the comments by President Bush when he met with President Basescu, have received more attention at the highest levels of our government and from other governments than it ever has in the past. There are a number of plans out there. There is the Yushchenko plan, which focuses on democratization of Transnistria, and I think it provides for a good basis for the 5+2 negotiations. It calls for a deployment of an international assessment mission to Transnistria to focus on what is needed for democratic conditions in that region. There are also I think, very constructive papers put forward by the former head of the OSCE mission on peacekeeping and on status issues. And those, too, I think, deserve a more thorough review and discussion. I think we also need to focus more on the issue of the peacekeeping force and look to internationalize it in a way that would bring greater stability and more of a long-term solution to the problem there. There are various efforts elsewhere out there. My preference would be to focus on the papers that are on the table, focus on the plans that have already been put forward, and not run the risk of getting engaged in too many diffuse efforts on this. There are many countries and organizations that can and should play important roles in solving this conflict. Obviously, the United States has a role to play. The EU has a role to play. OSCE has and will continue to play an important role. Council of Europe, countries such as Romania, obviously Russia, and obviously Ukraine, and Ukraine's maintenance of the customs agreement will be an important test for the new Ukrainian government, and that is an issue that we have raised in our bilateral discussions with the new government. In the near term, there is the issue of resuming negotiations, a position that we have strongly supported, and there seems to be in the works a call for resuming the negotiations sometime in the middle of October. The exact location of these is not clear, but I would argue that it's time to resume the negotiations, invite everyone who has been part of these, and whoever shows up, and whoever doesn't show up, I bet will show up the next time. But to me, it seems that allowing the Transnistrians to hold hostage the negotiations is something that we should bring an end to. It's time to end the suspension of the negotiations and to resume them as quickly as possible. We also all need to focus on working on confidence-building measures that have been a key part of the negotiations as well. And it's important, I think, for all sides, including the Russian side, Ukrainian side, to urge the Transnistrians to return to the table and to avoid provocative actions. One provocative action, I would argue, was the referendum that was held on September 17th in Transnistria, a referendum that no country has recognized. Some obviously took a stronger position on that than others. The United States issued a statement the day after saying we did not recognize it, that we viewed it as not contributing to stability in the region, and we then called for a resumption of negotiations. We were pleased to see similar statements and comments made by the EU member states, the OSCE chairman in office, Ukraine, and of course Moldova. From Moscow, there was a statement issued before the referendum that I think was not the most helpful, but there were comments made by Foreign Minister Lavrov a few days before the referendum and then afterward calling for resumption of negotiations, and that obviously is what we would want to hear. There has been support, certainly from Russia for the Transnistrian regime, support for the separatist leaders there, political, economic, military support, which has not been helpful in addressing this problem. And it is an issue that I think we all need to deal with very, very much. The hosting of meetings of separatist leaders, whether it's Mr. Smirnov or other leaders in the region, is also not helpful. Referring to Mr. Smirnov as president is not helpful. We would hope for more constructive steps in dealing with this problem. As I mentioned at the outset, the fulfillment of Istanbul commitments is an important tenet of our policy, and Russian troops that are there right now are there without the consent of the host government of Moldova, and not promoting a settlement of the conflict. Our position has been clear in terms of the connection of the continued presence of Russian troops with the adapted CFE ratification. We will not ratify the adapted CFE treaty until Moscow does fulfill the Istanbul commitments in Moldova, and it has made significant progress in Georgia. We would hope to see the same in Moldova as well. The lack of movement on withdrawal of the munitions, for example, has not taken place since early 2004. We would strongly encourage that to be resumed. There's, of course, what Moldova can do to address this problem, and long-term solution obviously requires that people in Transnistria see benefits to rejoining the rest of Moldova. Moldova must become an attractive place for Transnistrians to want to reunite with. And that means moving aggressively on economic reform, developing new markets, encouraging foreign investment, increasing exports, strengthening rule of law, ensuring respect for minority rights, increasing the standard of living, promoting respect for human rights, support civil society by bringing together youth from Moldova and the Transnistrian part of Moldova. It also means having the international community do more in reaching out to people in Transnistria. We, of course, welcome President Voronин's statements on the irreversibility of Moldova's European orientation. We also strongly support very good, healthy ties between Moldova and Russia. These two need not be mutually exclusive. The government of Moldova needs to implement reforms under the EU-Moldova Action Plan so that Moldova's relationship with the EU can become stronger. That is in Moldova's interest. It's in everyone's interest. And as the borders of the EU extend to Moldova's border with inclusion of Romania next year, this is all the more important. The United States is committed to helping the government of Moldova implement the key political economic reforms necessary to become a prosperous a prosperous democracy in Europe. And that is a commitment that is unwavering, and it is a commitment that not only I bring, but that people senior to me in the U.S. government bring. So with that, I think I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you.
There you go.
That's
Sorry
what I
about
think of you.
Elizabeth?
Okay, thank you very much, Maggie, and thank you to the Moldova Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for this kind invitation today. My task this afternoon is to introduce the report of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, the report of the European Affairs Committee on international law aspects of the separatist crisis in Moldova. And by way of background, I would like to describe the association, its mission, and its interest in this particular issue. The Association of the Bar was founded more than 135 years ago to promote the public good and advance high ethical standards in the legal profession. It is a non-political, non-partisan organization which seeks to promote the public good and advance the rule of law through the issuance of reports, major programs for the general public, etc. The reports of the association are widely circulated to government officials in the United States and other entities that are in a position to influence policy. The association currently has more than 22,000 members from all over the United States and includes international members as well. The work of the New York City Bar is not confined to New York. Over the past 35 years, or 25 years, the association has conducted a mission to places as diverse as Cuba, India, Hong Kong, Turkey, etc. Now, the European Affairs Committee became interested in the international legal aspect of the separatist claims in Moldova, which, of course, could threaten the peace and stability in the region. And after months of study, decided to send a legal assessment team to Moldova to examine the situation from an international law point of view, and if appropriate, to issue a report which could then be circulated. The team was led by Mark Meyer and consisted also of Barrington D. Parker, who is a United States Circuit Court judge for the Second Circuit in New York, Robert Abrams, who was a former Attorney General of the state of New York, and Chris Borgen, of course, who is the Associate Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law. And, of course, I was also a member of that team that went to Moldova and to Romania. Now, prior to going to Moldova, the team met with various experts from the United States State Department, as well as government officials from Moldova and Romania. All in all, the team met with over 20 persons in Moldova, including the President of Moldova, the Prime Minister, the Justice Minister, and the Chair of the Constitutional Court, and representatives of the OSCE, including Mr. Hill. In Romania, we met with the Foreign Minister and experts from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The team also traveled to the separatist entity of Transnistria and met with the self-proclaimed president and several of his top aides. All in all, more than 40 interviews were conducted by the team, and after extensive discussions among members of the committee, members of the team, and the executive committee of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, we were pleased to issue a report. Now, the report addresses solely the legal aspects of this frozen conflict. And indeed, many of the legal issues which appear in the Transnistria conflict are also common to the many other frozen conflicts that exist. These legal issues include a discussion of secession, self-determination, sovereignty, responsibility of de facto regimes, and responsibility of third parties, just to name a few of these issues that were discussed in the report. And now I'm pleased to turn this over to Professor Borgen, who will discuss the legal aspects of the report.
Thank you. As
Dean Defeis said, we covered a variety of issues in the report. And what I'd like to do now for just a few minutes is to pick 3 issues, sort of the 3 main ones from which all of our other discussions come, and to set them out, particularly for what I assume is a non-legal audience. I'm assuming that most people here are probably not public international lawyers. So I'll try to give a little bit of background in terms of framing these issues, framing the legal issues, and how it deals with, or how it could affect some of the discussion regarding the Transnistrian conflict. The 3 issues that I'm going to focus on are, first, the question of self-determination, which is really the big-ticket issue. That is, does Transnistria have some type of right under international law to secede and to be its own country? The second issue is looking at the status of what it is now. How do we describe Transnistria as an entity under law? That is there any type of mechanism that we can use in the law to describe what it is and what is going on there? And finally, to look at the actions of third-party states being other states somehow involved in this conflict. And in particular, what I'll do is focus on questions regarding the legality of Russian actions vis-a-vis what is happening within Moldova. So first, regarding self-determination. Self-determination is a term that has sort of a popular usage, but as a matter of law, it's a little bit more precise. It's a topic that's fairly misunderstood. Although it's a term that was used by Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points, it is part of the UN Charter, and so on. It is, as a legal right, the meaning is perhaps a little bit different than just the general sense of the norm. And in part, what I'll do is describe a little bit of what self-determination is by talking a little bit about this situation here. The first thing to note about self-determination, and maybe one of the ways that is a term that it is misused, is that self-determination is in no way the same thing as some type of general right to secession. Self-determination is not equal to secession. Self-determination has to do actually with the ability to express your own culture, your own beliefs, and to have some type of say in the politics of your state. This is so in terms of international law, there are actually 2 types of self-determination. There's what we call internal self-determination, which is what might be more generally referred to as minority rights, to make sure that a minority within a political community has a certain amount of cultural freedom, freedom of education, language freedoms, linguistic freedoms, and so on. There's also external self-determination, which is when a community actually has a right to secede. The default rule in the international system is one of internal self-determination. That is, we look first to see whether the cultural, linguistic, and other values of a community can be honored within the state in which it currently exists. So, this traces back to opinions from a century ago or so in international law. One of the most famous is one called the Åland Islands decision, which actually had to do with a dispute over some territory between Finland and Sweden. So if a country, or if a group of people within a country seek to secede, they have to get over the hurdle of first trying to prove that their minority rights are not respected within the country that they are currently in. Claims of secession have tended to be the strongest when certain hurdles are passed. Those hurdles, the 3 that you tend to see, are first, that the group seeking secession can be thought of as a people, which is sort of a specifically defined term in international law, meaning an ethnic group. Second, that people faces serious human rights harms, serious human rights violations in the state in which they're currently living. And third, that there is no other possible solution for the conflict under either domestic law or international law. So they have to be a people facing serious human rights violations, and essentially there's no other solution but for secession. In looking at the facts in Moldova, through all the interviews and historical research and so on, we find it exceedingly difficult to find any type of claim, credible claim, for secession by the Transnistrians. In fact, we find really no strong basis at all for a claim of secession. Let's take each of these sort of very quickly, and then we can talk more about it in the time for questions. Are the Transnistrians a people? That is, are they some type of separate ethnicity from the rest of Moldova? Ethnographically, there's really no evidence of this. On both the right and the left bank of the Dniester River, you have roughly similar ethnic breakdowns among ethnic Moldovans, Russians, Ukrainians, and others. There's no good ethnographic evidence that somehow there's a separate Transnistrian people. And of those, this is probably one of the weakest parts of the argument. The second argument is the serious human rights violation, or questions of serious human rights violations. The way that this was put to us when we spoke with representatives or when we spoke with leaders in Transnistria was they said, look, first, there was a horrible war in 1992, which was brought to us. We didn't bring the war, was their basic argument. We had people who were killed then, about 1,000, and we feared that there would be more killing now if we were somehow reintegrated. When you look at the claims of various groups in modern history who have sought to secede, this does not rise to the point of being a credible claim of an ongoing serious human rights violation. They're looking back to an incident which had occurred at this point 15 years ago. And keep in mind that, if anything, Moldova has had an ameliorating record on human rights in those 15 years. And Transnistria itself has had a record that has been getting worse and worse. So actually, the political unit that is more protective of human rights is Moldova itself. So there's little to no credibility of the fact that the only way to get away from serious human rights violations would be to secede, particularly if you take a look at some of the Department of State country reports assessing human rights in Moldova, and particularly read the sections on Transnistria, you would see that there are serious problems there in terms of religious freedoms and so on. And finally, that there are no other remedies under domestic or international law. I'm going to set this aside for the moment, just keeping in mind that there have been various offers of different versions of autonomy within Moldova, which have been largely rejected. The basic idea of simply reintegrating Transnistria to Moldova could be viewed as a solution because there's no credible belief, or there's no credible threat, that the minority rights of whatever minority exists somehow in Transnistria would face serious human rights violations if it was reintegrated into Moldova. So this was sort of the crux of the argument in terms of issues that were discussed regarding self-determination. And as I'd said, we can talk about this at greater length, or I can expand on it during the time for questions. I want to take just one moment to deal with this issue of a referendum, which has been the latest iteration of the argument that under international law there is some type of right to secession. And the Transnistrians have essentially argued, Igor Smirnov and Valery Litsky and their cohorts, have argued that inasmuch as we've had a referendum which has 97.2%, let's say, that says we want to be our own country, the international community is thus bound to respect our wishes, to respect our desire for self-determination, external self-determination, and they are bound to let us go. That is, there's some type of legal right that they have to thus secede. This could not be more false. For one thing, cases that have specifically dealt with this issue under international law, going back to the 1920s, have explicitly said you cannot have a secessionist entity poll itself and say, do we feel like seceding? I mean, just think of it, that sounds kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, so that doesn't work. That can't bind the whole country. What international law has said is if a country chooses to resolve a secessionist crisis by saying we will have a referendum to decide it. That is, in this case, if the government of Moldova chooses to allow a referendum to decide the situation, that is allowed. That's the case of essentially what we saw in Serbia-Montenegro, where the Constitution had explicitly said that Montenegro would have the ability to separate based on a referendum. That's not what you have here in Transnistria, where it was sort of a, Igor Smirnov-run referendum. Now, both the general rules of self-determination and those specific rules having to do with the referendum make sense, both in terms of law but also pragmatically, when we think about what these rules mean for the international system. The first is that as a basic rule of international law, it should be, and it is, hard to dismember a state. States are the building blocks of the international system. It should not be easy to tear one apart. You should have hurdles that you have to get over. Transnistria has not shown, or Igor Smirnov and his cohorts have not shown, that they get over any of those hurdles in this case. Similarly, a referendum in and of itself is not democratic. In this case, where you're polling a specific group under conditions that are not even, that don't even rise to the level of being recognized as free and fair elections, is not somehow more democratic. If anything, that's somewhat dishonest. So these rules of international law also make pragmatic sense. Now, briefly, for just a few moments, I want to touch on two other topics from our report. The first has to do with, okay, if Transnistria does not have some right to secede, then what is it under international law? I mean, it has been holding territory for 15 years. It's not recognized by a single other country, but it's had effective control over a strip of land. So how should we view this entity? This is a somewhat unique situation in international law, but there are strong analogies, if not directly applicable law. What we have in Transnistria is best thought of as an example of belligerent occupation. The occupation of territory by a belligerency, by a group that is fighting the main government. It just so happens that the government of Moldova and the Transnistrians are trying to resolve this right now more or less around the negotiating table. So it's not a shooting war at the moment, but it's still a state of occupation. Now, we thought that there was an argument to be made that some of the specific rules of this, that is the rules of the Geneva Conventions, particularly Geneva Convention 4, could directly apply. For one thing, Moldova is a member to the conventions. However, without even going that far, we simply say that by analogy to the conventions and by looking to the general norms of international law when there are belligerencies, the best way that we can think of Transnistria, the analogy that makes the most sense, is to think of this as what's called a de facto regime. So if it is a de facto regime, what does that mean? First, it does not rise to the level of being a state. Transnistria is not a state. The Transnistrian Moldovan Republic is not a state. The people who have effective control of Transnistria are given the leeway to do what is necessary simply for the care and feeding of the population. Right? This also makes sense as a rule under international law. You don't want civilians to starve or die or be hurt while conflicts are being resolved. However, being a de facto regime also means that you are severely restricted in terms of your leeway of activity. You cannot, for example, do things which would change the underlying sort of economic structure of the territory that you hold. So, for example, you can't take assets that had been formed that were essentially that were non-military assets, either of the government, and you can't take any private property at all and start selling it to third parties. You can't sell electrical plants. You can't sell bakeries. You can't sell steel mills. All right? All of that is a big no-no under international law. Once again, that makes sense because you don't want occupations to be essentially, excuses for plunder. So that's not allowed under international law, and yet, as we know, that's what's been occurring in Transnistria. The major economic assets of Moldova that have been held there have in large part been sold off. I mean, some of the numbers are telling that. Some of the numbers are telling in terms of the selling off of the steel mills, of electrical utilities, and so on. There is whoever purchases such entities has no comfort under international law that their contracts would necessarily be respected. It's whether or not they are respected can become a political question or political issue for the government of Moldova to decide if there's ever reintegration. But it's a sort of this is very much a buyer beware situation as far as a legal matter. For the last point, to say just before closing off, a couple of quick words about third-party states, and in particular Russia. We spent a little bit of time talking about whether or not the activities of Russia could be viewed in any way as a violation of international law. As you know, there's still a segment of the Russian 14th Army that is garrisoned in Transnistria. There are Russian military stocks that are still held in Transnistria. And there has been a variety of other things. Russian economic pressure, such as the banning of Moldovan wines and of meats. Russia is one of Moldova's major export partners, and the effects have been rather large. Something like, I think, a 58% drop in the Moldovan wine industry overall since the ban has taken place. This is equal to something like a 7% hit to their GDP. It's had spillover effects in other industries, particularly glassworks. And as well as, besides the economic pressure and the activities of the Russian army, also the ties between the TMR and the Russian leadership. You often hear factions within the Duma who are talking about how Transnistria needs to not only become independent, but needs to become part of Russia. And also just the general diplomatic stance of the Russian Federation. We can talk about these sort of more specifically in the question time, but we didn't argue that any one of these necessarily is a violation of international law. But what we do think is that taking together all of these different activities, going back to the 1992 war, if you sort of connect the dots, it makes a very compelling picture that Russia is a central actor in this conflict, and that their activities could rise to the level of being a violation of international law. With this, I will turn things over to Mark Meyer, who is the head of our mission, to talk a little bit about not just where we've been in terms of some of the analysis, but what some of the implications are for this going forward.
Thank you, Chris. And thank all of you for being here and for giving us the opportunity to talk to you a bit about Moldova and the role that the New York City Bar has thus far played in trying to bring about the resolution of this conflict. What I want to talk to you about briefly, so that we can get to questions and answers, is what contribution, if any, this report has made to the dialogue that exists on the issue of this particular frozen conflict. It appears to us that by raising the issues of the rule of law, we have added a new dimension to the discussion of the resolution of the Transnistrian conflict, which heretofore has been basically discussed purely in political terms, although it clearly has substantial legal aspects in international law. Bringing the rule of law into the discussions of this conflict has, it appears to us at least, has empowered the Moldovan government to understand that it has indeed an arsenal of weapons that it can use in international forums to bring pressure on third-party states to adhere to international law and to resolve the conflict. We talk about this, I guess, because we don't see the role of the New York City Bar as simply preparing reports and then dropping them into a hamper somewhere and walking away. There is a certain responsibility that you have once you put discourse into the public arena to follow through with it and to, at least in some effort, bring some effort to the implementation of the thoughts and ideas that originate out of the report. And to that extent, what we hope will come from this report is an increased awareness on the part of the international community of exactly what its responsibility is in the resolution of this conflict. And we have a number of thoughts that we've raised in different forums. We did this just recently in Chisinau at a conference sponsored by the Moldovan Parliament. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the report from the point of view of activism is that section on the commercial aspects of the actions of the Transnistrians in selling off the assets of the Moldovan state, primarily to foreign, primarily Russian and Ukrainian business people. It's our view that Transnistria really is a lot easier to solve than the other frozen conflicts. The other frozen conflicts involve many more issues that are both ethnic and are more to the heart of Russian interests. Transnistria, it appears to us, is a business. And if you attack that business internationally, it may, in fact, have an impact on the ultimate resolution of the conflict. What am I talking about? Most of the people who have bought assets from Transnistria have, in essence, converted the assets of the Republic of Moldova. Those are businessmen that have interests in other parts of the world, particularly in other parts of Europe. Were they to be sued in jurisdictions where this type of action can be maintained for conversion of the assets of the Republic of Moldova, it would cause a tremendous stir within the Russian business community that is supporting this Transnistrian separatist state. And it might, in fact, bring pressure on the Russian Federation from its own business interests to bring about a resolution. That's one aspect that we see the report can be useful. Another in raising awareness is to hold hearings throughout the parliaments of Europe and also in Brussels for the benefit of the European Union on the issues that are raised in this report and otherwise with respect to the issue of Transnistria. In that regard, we have strongly urged the Senate, and in particular the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Subcommittee on European Affairs, to hold hearings in the next session on the issue of the frozen conflicts and spend some of that time focused on Transnistria. We also have suggested that civil claimants that have been in some way injured through the loss of property or other human rights in Transnistria pursue actions in the European Court against Russia on the basis of the Ilashku opinion, which probably most of you here are aware of, but it's an opinion that basically holds Russia accountable for what happens in Transnistria. We've also urged that civil society activities increase, just like this forum, for example, but also throughout Europe, so that the civil society begins to play a role in the resolution of the frozen conflicts. One aspect that we had suggested that has already taken place, to the great credit of the government of Moldova, is to take this conflict to the General Assembly. And as probably most of you know, it is now on the agenda for the General Assembly, and our report has been made a UN document, or rather I think it's October 3rd it will be made a UN document, and is the basis for part of the discussion that will occur at the General Assembly. Among other things, we also think that the Human Rights Council, when it issues a report on Russia, should be made aware of objections to the Russian report on the issue of Transnistria. We think also that it might be appropriate to move the Transnistrian section of the United States State Department's country report on Russia to the Russian report, since Moldova is in no way capable of controlling the situation right now in Transnistria. It seems much more. When I say on the Russian section, I don't mean to suddenly give them sovereignty, but to place in that section the report that deals with the territory that the Russians obviously have a greater influence in, because the human rights violations that are occurring there are not the responsibility or the fault of the Moldovan government. I wanted to make two other points very quickly. One was what Secretary Kramer pointed out, which is very important and needs to be considered, and that's that making Moldova more attractive to the people on the right bank of the Dniester River is essential. And part of that means that Moldova needs to implement the EU Moldova Action Plan, and it needs to deal with the issues of corruption, particularly corruption within the judiciary, because small and medium-sized investors will simply not come to Moldova until they can be assured that, at least in the court system, they will have a fair shake. So it's one aspect that we are also pushing on the Republic of Moldova. And finally, I think that all of us have to give some thought as to how we can help the Republic of Moldova implement some of these thoughts that we've raised and others have raised. Because the fact of the matter is that the Republic of Moldova lacks the capacity and the capability to undertake some of these actions. And if there was a way in which they could be assisted in this regard, it would be greatly helpful. So I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to let me give you some of our thoughts and to listen to what we have to say. Now we'd like to hear, I guess, what you have to say. No, we have... I should point out to you one aspect of this report that is certainly not highlighted, and that is the role that Ambassador Hill played. I don't think that any of us would have come away with as clear an understanding as we did of the conflict, but for the many, many hours that Ambassador William Hill spent with us. And I want to echo what Secretary Kramer said. I know the criticism, and I actually know and admire some of the critics, but in this regard, the criticism of Ambassador Hill is, I think, woefully unfounded. He has been a great friend of Moldova and a great friend to us, so it's a pleasure to introduce Ambassador Hill to you.
Ambassador Hill?
Thanks. Thanks very much, and thank you for those kind words. It's always a pleasure to combine two of my favorite things, to come back to the Kennan Institute and to talk about Moldova. And to have them come together is very fortuitous. And David Kramer didn't mention one other thing that we have in common that may be important in this particular context. We both happen to be Boston Red Sox fans, which means that we know that no matter how long something goes on, there's always hope. It's also a particular pleasure to talk a little bit about the New York Bar Association report. I did have the pleasure of meeting the delegation, talking with them in Moldova, discussing the issues with them there, corresponding, and they've come out with, I think, a very professional, a very comprehensive and authoritative and a very necessary and welcome document. In particular, the report serves to provide an authoritative, impartial statement on the issues of law involving the status and the particulars of the Transnistrian conflict. I mean, the report clearly was so well done that in the sincerest form of flattery, someone in Tiraspol or Moscow had to invent a new institute and issue a mock report in answer to try to counter the arguments and the conclusions presented in this report. You get, in reading this report, a clear, unambiguous judgment on the claims to historical and juridical legitimacy of Transnistria's claim to independence. I mean, they don't have a convincing claim under international law. There's also a very impartial and comprehensive statement on the involvement and the consistency or inconsistency of this involvement of third-party states in the dispute. And this is very useful because there are a lot of polemics on all sides on these questions, and speaking from the point of view of a participant in the negotiations and a practitioner, it's very, very helpful to have from outside clear and impartial and unambiguous material with which to work. From all of this, you've heard, and I think the report is worth reading, not just the executive summary, but through it. It provides a good background, good clear statement and explanation of why Transnistria does not have a convincing claim to independence, and why Russia, the Russian Federation, bears significant responsibility for failures to resolve the conflict. Now, all of this is very good. We know what's wrong. The harder question, we've heard a little bit from both Mr. Kramer and Mr. Meyer, the harder question is what to do about all of it. In particular, I would say, from my perspective, the most difficult of the multiple questions that we faced in looking to how to solve this is how to convince Russia to become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. It's easy to blame, but it's much harder to convince, to find convincing solutions and actions, and to convince one's interlocutors to go forward with these. Of course, I mean, I start from a basis. Without question, one needs to insist that Russia fulfill obligations taken on itself, like the repeated commitment to withdraw its military forces from Moldova, the deadline for which deadline was established at the Istanbul OSCE summit. The deadline's been missed, but the commitment antedates that. There's also the Russian commitment to Moldovan territorial integrity. And here you have a phenomenon where the executive branch in Moscow says one thing, the State Duma says another thing, and basically they get to have their cake and eat it too. However, it seems to me, after being there for a long time, it's vain to hope or think that one can either exclude wholly Russian influence from the region, and it's a misapprehension to think that if you could just get the Russians to leave, that everything would be solved instantly. The conflict has geopolitical elements, especially after the latest EU and NATO expansion. There is international competition, and certainly whether it is there or not, the Russians perceive a competition there between Russia on the one hand, the EU and the United States and NATO on the other hand. But there are also local elements to the conflict, especially elements or disputes between local elites growing out of over 50 years of Soviet and post-Soviet history. And one ignores these only at the peril of missing a solution. Very, very briefly, to not being comprehensive, but to try to cap off what I've heard here, what you've all heard here, and to provoke some discussion. I think you've basically heard some of the significant steps here that need to be done. For Moldova, in approaching the problem, the Moldovan authorities need to forget or remind themselves constantly that there will not be And it's useless to hope or to think or to let anyone else talk about the application of force, either from Chisinau or abroad. The same thing, I doubt very much that there will be a settlement imposed externally by any set, or certainly by any individual or small group of larger external actors. Clearly, the villains in the peace are clear. I worked with the Transnistrian negotiators for 6 years. Their main task during most of these negotiations was to delay, obfuscate, and prevent reaching a solution. They were very good at it, and they've been successful during most of this. I can condemn them now and on into the unforeseeable future, but that still won't get us to a solution. The Moldovan authorities need both carrots and sticks. I mean, the sticks, you can find the sticks in many places. They're sort of obvious. The carrots, this is what we've heard, is making the answer obvious. A typical dialogue I would have with Transnistrians, I would say very bluntly, you should settle. And they'd look at me and say, well, why should we? What you need is the answer to that second question, and that's because Moldova is prosperous, it's growing, it's attracting investment, it's got closer ties to the European Union, whose economic markets Transnistrian industry penetrated at one point when they were using Moldovan documentation. Many, many reasons, but the point is to get beyond the pressure and recriminations, which the recriminations may be clearly justified, but they're also not effective. They may make the person uttering them feel better, but it doesn't get you to a solution. What's really necessary is to follow through on an effective program of reforms, market reforms, democratization, enrichment of the country, getting the population to come back, the 500,000 or more of the population working abroad, to gather the resources and further development that basically makes reintegration of the country attractive and makes it hard to resist and harder for an external actor to convince local elites that resistance to the process of reintegration is in their interest. Now, for Russia, the same thing. I think you need a package of carrots and sticks. One problem that we've had all along is that somehow many in the Russian political elite have perceived the greater involvement of whether the U.S. or the EU in Moldova as a loss for Russia. And one of the great challenges is to get the Russian leadership out of the zero-sum mentality and to convince them that a win-win solution is possible. One of the problems in formulating a workable win-win solution is trying to discover or decide what Moscow wants. Do they want, well, before 1991, the involvement from Moscow in Moldova was clear. There were strong elements trying to preserve the USSR. After 1991, it's harder to say. There are those in Moscow that have a nostalgia for empire. There are those who may wish to territorially to reconstruct either the great Russian or the Soviet state. There are those who see involvement and orientation of Moldova or Transnistria in Moldova, so orientation towards Moscow as a means of stopping EU and NATO, further EU and NATO expansion. Finally, there are the economic and personal interests of key players in these elites, a number of deputies in the State Duma, some in the executive branch in Moscow that have clear interests in keeping the giant offshore in Transnistria effectively independent. All of the above. You need a combination of carrot and sticks. The sticks press Russia to fulfill its commitments, to respect international law, but again, an incentive to do this. If you simply tell Moscow, well, if you withdraw your troops, fulfill Istanbul, restore Moldova's territorial integrity, everyone will respect you, and you can look in a mirror and feel good, that may all be true, but it's probably not going to be enough. It may require a process of linkage. there are things that Moscow wants. And it may be that one has to link participation in international bodies that play by international rules, from which Russia would benefit. One obvious is the WTO, but linkage of progress in these things with respect for commitments and international rules in other fields. But I think it's this territory that one needs to look at and mine, looking that you need both. You need to say what's wrong, recognize it, and stop it, but you also have to have an idea of where you're going, or else you may not get there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. This is we have a lot of material to work with. I was thinking we have this room until 4 o'clock, and afterwards I meant to mention right away the Moldova Foundation has very graciously brought a wine a wine tasting event that will be across the hall. So please join us at after 4 o'clock. And so we have 45 minutes for discussion. I think the best thing to do. Thank you very much. I now have an identity again. So, why don't we start then and ask that our speakers, if they'd like to respond to anything that the ambassadors had to say, and then why don't we go into the audience? Because again, I feel that we've covered a great deal of territory, and there's a lot of fodder for discussion, but there might be some immediate comments. Now, are we ready to go straight to the floor? Okay, please, then the floor is yours. Yes, right here. We have a microphone. I asked, it would be great if you could identify yourself before you ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Todd Stewart. Mr. Meyer, you mentioned that Moldova does not have the resources to follow up on your report in many areas, and you suggested that other actors, both state and private, I believe, might be able to make a contribution in helping Moldova in this respect. What specifically did you have in mind?
Well, I can give you one idea. I'm not sure I have a full array a full arsenal for Moldova, but I'll give you one example. I think that Moldova needs to have the self-confidence to ask for the benefit of the resources of the Romanian Foreign Ministry. They have the legal capability to assist them in advising them in a lot of these areas and that Moldova simply doesn't have. And I say the self-confidence because those of you that are familiar with Moldovan and Romanian relations understand that it's quite strange and quite awkward. But the fact of the matter is that Romania is probably Moldova's greatest friend, not a country that wishes to absorb it, that can possibly do that economically or politically or otherwise. It's simply their friend. And that's one area where Moldova can turn for substantial assistance. If there is financial assistance that's available, in order to hire counsel to pursue some of the human rights matters, for example, that's another area. But the fact is that the Moldovans do not have the capability that other governments have that have existed for longer periods of time. I mean, they simply don't have the people who have this knowledge. And that's one of the problems in pursuing some of the avenues that we've raised.
Right here. And then Wayne.
Hi, Vlad Spina, Moldova Foundation. My question is for U.S. government and for OCSC, and if you can answer Ambassador Hill for OCSC. Right now, the actions were focused on talking to Transnistrians elite. But we know that Transnistria, or people in Transnistria, are divided in large by three major groups. First group is the political elite, intelligence services of Russia, sent to Transnistria in 1992 to form, and as you said, Ambassador Hill, to preserve the status quo. Second group, also a small one, is the business elite that emerged in the last 5 to 10 years. And the large group is the population. So my questions to you is the following. What have done OCSCE and what plans to do new actors, US government and European Union to work with the larger group that is not represented by these two small groups? and I'm talking about democratization. There is no democratization. There is human rights violations. What have you done in order to address this important issue that would be a solution from the bottom up, not from the up to bottom? Thank you.
Okay, well, I will tell you, I would not entirely agree with the way you analyze the Transnistrian population. I mean, there was a large, decent cadre of the so-called Red Directors, an economic group of managers from the Soviet times, some of whom went west in Moldova, many of whom stayed east. But we, for example, during my time in the OSCE mission, I'll say we tried to talk with as many different people in the left bank territories controlled by the authorities in Tiraspol. We didn't have as much of a problem. We had extensive contacts in the Moldovan-controlled lands on the left bank, Košnice, Malovata Noa, Korž, and Kočer, so forth and so on. But we met a number of opposition political figures and members in their parties, journalists. I'm thinking of people like Radchenko, Buchatsky, Grigory Volavoy, whom I met when he was trying to run for the Bender City Council. The parents' organizations in the Moldovan schools, we know very well and saw regularly all of the directors of the Moldovan Latin script schools in Transnistrian territory, and the parents. I spoke to and talked with the parents myself. Transnistria maintained essentially a very strong KGB and a Soviet-style system or quasi-Soviet-style system of social control, which is how they prevented the formation of all but the most determined NGOs and political parties. The other thing that we found in meeting with population was that the authorities did their best to buy them off. Communal services, utilities, water, light, heat, komunalne uslugi, were subsidized at artificially low levels. So often factory workers were relatively happy if they weren't politically conscious. They were relatively happy because they paid less. And many of them have relatives on the right bank, and so they hear, our medical stuff and costs less than over on the right bank. It's a means of manipulating and at least preventing discontent among the population. My overall impression is the population on the left bank is not terribly different from the population on the right bank, and that it was artificially restrained from making the same kind of transition that Moldova made from the Soviet Republic to what it is today and is becoming, and that in particular, if one removes the KGB, the police control of society, that a relatively quick and perhaps effective transition could be accomplished. The one thing that I would caution is I wouldn't necessarily expect people on the left bank to vote exactly as they do on the right bank or to favor the same things. Our perception was certainly in previous times is that they tended to be further to the left than population Moldova, in particular as it becomes social democratic economic issues. But this is something we can't prove.
Let me just very quickly. When Heather Hodges was ambassador to Moldova, the United States opened up a health clinic in Transnistria focused on HIV/AIDS. We want to do more of that kind of activity. We want to have more exchanges with the population of Transnistria. I've met with independent journalists from there. I have been through the negotiations, have traveled there a few times, have not really had much opportunity to interact with the general population. I'd like to do more of that. the message from the United States government is that we are a friend of the people of Moldova, all the people of Moldova, on both the left and right banks. And the problems that may exist deal with the regime that's in Tiraspol, not with the population. And so we do want to make a more concerted effort to reach out to them.
Okay, I'm starting to get a lot of hands. I'm seeing 1, 2, and then 3, 4. So first Wayne, and then we'll go right behind you.
Thank you. Wayne Murray, the American Foreign Policy Council. I suppose for every 1,000 Americans who's ever talked about the Transnistria problem, of which I'm a member, there's perhaps only 3 or 4 who ever tried to do anything about it, and Bill Hill's probably the veteran member of that small group. What I'd like you to talk a bit about, Bill, is the subject which attracted to you perhaps the most venom, vitriol, and opprobrium, which is the effort to find a federal solution to the problem, and particularly why that was so negative. Because anyone familiar with the history of East, Central, Southeast Europe in the interwar period is familiar with the failure of the efforts in almost every state to create unitary states, even where the natural state solution was obviously federal, I mean, even in Czechoslovakia, and the almost complete record of state failure of attempted unitary states when faced with a political crisis. Why, given that history and given the record of other federal successes within the broader European system, was the reaction in Moldova, in many parts of the political elite, to your efforts so negative? Not so personal, but why was it so negative?
The most vehement denunciations came from portions of the intellectual elite in Chisinau that I would call the most strongly Romanophone or Romanophile. And they feared that, grossly oversimplifying, but I got the sense that they feared that establishing a federal system in Moldova would do 2 things. First of all, it would enable the Russian Federation to dominate one of the federal units, Transnistria or maybe one of the others, and thereby maintain an endless influence in Moldova. And it would also enable other national or ethnic groupings in Moldova to break away. The Gagauz in the south, but also the Ukrainians in the north, where there are several areas where there are compact populations of the Ukrainian minority. It's remarkable. There has been a consistent element, one element among many in Moldovan politics, that has desired a unitary state dominated by the so-called titular nationality in Moldova, and this has been the case from the very beginning when Moldova got independence. In the OSCE mission, while this was going on, I had a chance to go back and read accounts of the mission of a conference in Chisinau in July of 1993, while the Moldovan parliament was engaged in writing the current constitution. It had not yet been written or adopted. And there was a tremendous debate, and the loudest debate and most violent debate occurred in the half day where some Moldovan speakers and outsiders broached the idea of establishing a federation. And the denunciations were at least equal, or perhaps more vehement, than those that were directed at all of us that suggested a federal solution in 2002, 2003, 2004. The supreme irony of all of this is that the first, or the proposal for a federal solution, ultimately came from native sources in Chisinau and was supported I mean, I come from a federal country. It didn't seem like a bad idea to me. But it's been an internal Moldovan dispute from the very beginning, and one on which there is still no agreement and very, very high emotions.
Anything any of our other panelists would like to add there? No?
No, I think we'd like to stay away from the federalism issue.
Okay, for now, unless from the floor, no question? Okay, there was a question there, right? And the microphone come in then.
My name is David Binder, and I'd like to address this question to Mr. Kramer. Given that there are some parallels between the situation of Kosovo, Serbia, and of Moldova, Transnistria, just as there are some very sharp contrasts, nevertheless, people watching Russia at least, note that the Russians seem to have Transnistria on their minds. Moscow has Transnistria on its mind when it is discussing Kosovo and what position it might take on the final status of Kosovo in the UN-administered talks.
Well, if I understand the question, it's about the precedent argument that's made. And our position has been very clear that Kosovo is not a precedent for any of these other conflicts. Did I misunderstand you?
Not the precedent, it's the question, how do you see this playing a role or not a role in, how do you see this playing a role or not playing a role in the next months and years regarding both situations, if you will?
From our perspective, it plays no role. And this is why I was asking about whether you're, not that you're suggesting it's a precedent, but if others see it as a precedent. We don't see it as a precedent, and therefore it shouldn't play a role in solving the issue of Transnistria or any of the other conflicts. Kosovo came about as a result of ethnic cleansing by Milosevic, NATO intervention, UN administration, and none of those factors exist in the situation in Transnistria. In Montenegro, you had a mutually agreed upon constitutional process. You're shaking your head. What am I doing wrong?
You don't get it.
What am I not getting?
I'm saying that the Russians seem to see the Kosovo situation.
Ask the Russians, don't ask me.
I asked you if you thought this was going to play any role in the resolution of the Transnistria dispute.
Of course. I mean, you've answered your own. It's not a question, it's a comment. The Russians do cite Kosovo in talking about Transnistria. What I'm trying to give you is our response to that. You've already mentioned that the Russians have been raising this, so it does play a role from their perspective. It doesn't from our perspective. Sorry, I'm clearly missing something here, which I don't understand. I don't know. Maybe the other panelists can address it.
I would just actually echo what Secretary Kramer was saying, was that on a technical matter, on a legal matter, from an international law perspective, that the situations are completely distinguishable. And I understand that that there's been a lot of talk trying to bring it together, and we've seen that in terms of the Transnistrians saying that they've been watching very carefully what's been happening in Montenegro, that as well as those in South Ossetia who are also planning a referendum have been saying that they're watching very carefully what's happening in Transnistria. But in terms of in this case, the more sort of legal answer, or legalistic answer, or diplomatic law answer, is that all of these situations are quite different, specifically along the lines of what David was saying, which is that in Serbia, Montenegro, there was an agreement to allow a referendum. You do not have that here in Transnistria. In Kosovo, there was the fact that it was an intervention to head off a humanitarian disaster and that it became an internationally administered territory makes it, legally speaking, a completely different situation than what you have in Transnistria, where there is a sitting domestic government, the government of Moldova, which is not being viewed as having some type of horrendous human rights record, which is taking it off, which is sort of pushing it off, as was the case in Serbia, Montenegro, and specifically in the Kosovo example, and that they are trying to keep their country whole. So legally speaking, they're quite distinguishable.
Okay, I'm afraid that David Kramer is going to have to leave us now. We'll give a collective thanks to you at the end for your comments.
Sure. Thanks. Sorry.
Yes. We still have some time for questions. Anything from the... Yes, please. Thank you very much.
Forgive me for not getting up. My name is Armand Scala. I'm with the Congress of Romanian Americans. I'd like to ask Mr. Meyer to what extent his group had an attitude to prove the legitimacy of Transnistria before they went.
We had no attitude whatsoever. I mean, I think as Dean Defeis mentioned, I mean, we have a Second Circuit Court of Appeals judge, a former a New York State Attorney General, 2 law professors, and me. We'd never been to Transnistria. We had no idea what we were seeing. We had no preconceived notions whatsoever. We made a real effort to be as open to the facts and the circumstances as possible. And I think in large part through particularly through the scholarship of Professor Borgen, who was the principal author of this report, I think we succeeded.
Okay, question here.
Nazar Holot-Cannon, a scholar. I would like to ask, what role can Ukraine play in resolving this conflict?
There's a good question.
And has this role changed during the last couple of years?
I would love to answer that, but I think Ambassador Hill is probably the guy to answer the question. So,
you're on.
No ukraińska mowa. Okay. No, obviously Ukraine has a great role to play and has been deeply involved in the settlement process, sometimes more constructively than others. But after the Orange Revolution, there was a real change in the Ukrainian approach to the Transnistrian question. I mean, the first role that Ukraine has is obvious. I mean, Transnistria's economy is export-oriented. Transnistria imports things, processes, manufactures them, and exports them. And without cooperation from Ukraine and right bank Moldova, Transnistria cannot survive, purely and simply. Or as one Transnistrian commentator told, or one Transnistrian observer told me, you know, if Ukraine and Kiev and Chisinau get together and control the border, and the EU and the US cooperate, all the Russians can do is watch from their barracks windows while the problem is solved. The problem is how to do this consistent with without making the problem worse. I mean, you know, what you saw play out early this year was a case in point where Ukraine, in cooperation with Chisinau and the EU Border Assistance Mission, did establish a system of registration and control on the border, which allowed Transnistrian enterprises to continue trading, importing and exporting, but on the condition that they registered cost-free with Moldova, and therefore established a degree of transparency and accountability on the trade across the border. There was tremendous resistance from Tiraspol, a self-imposed blockade or stoppage of imports and exports for a time being. and a massive hue and cry and assistance from some quarters from the north from Russia. Clearly, this is the key point in resolving the issue, and active cooperation of Ukraine in issues of the border, restoring legality, restoring adherence to international norms, will go a long way to providing a background that's more conducive to reaching a solution. But it is not the whole of reaching a solution. So far, from the formulation and presentation of the Yushchenko plan to the enforcement of the joint declaration on the border, and the participation in the 5+2 negotiation process, my experience was personally that the changes in Ukrainian policy since late 2004, early 2005, have made a tremendous change in our ability to formulate and to try then to reach agreement on constructive solutions. We obviously, this obviously hasn't convinced everyone that needs to be convinced, but it was a real sea change in the correlation of forces, and I think one that ultimately works to the interests of reaching a sustainable, peaceful solution and resolving the conflict.
Okay, I have a question right here in the actually two first. First you, and then the woman in front of you.
Thank you. My name is Pamela Smith, and I have a question related to the last one, only on the other side, for Mr. Meyer. I just got back from Chisinau, and one of the things that I kept hearing about was that hundreds and possibly thousands of people are lining up to apply for visas to Romania. Now that Romania has a clear date into the EU, how do you think, and I know you know Romania well, how do you think Romania's accession will affect these issues that you've been discussing so interestingly in Moldova? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think Romania is now free to raise these issues in the European Union, where heretofore I think they were reluctant. I mean, you I think may all know that when President Iliescu was president, even under President Constantinescu, the issue of Transnistria was not often discussed. And my feeling is that the reason for that was that they didn't want to bring attention to a conflict on their own borders that might affect their accession to the European Union. The situation changed with the election of Traian Băsescu as president. And Băsescu has strongly raised the issue of Transnistria in a lot of forums. Indeed, with President Bush in the Oval Office on his last visit. And both he and President Bush, in their statements after their meeting, discussed the issue of Transnistria and the sovereign, the inviolability of the sovereign rights of Moldova. So there's a new attitude that the Romanians are able now to express, and being free to do so in Brussels, I think you're going to hear a great deal more from the Romanians. It's why I really stress so much that the Moldovans reach out to their friends across the border. And I'm somewhat hopeful that that is actually going to happen. The Romanians, on the other hand, have to stop talking about the unity of all Romanians. There's nothing wrong with what they're saying, and the remarks of President Basescu, if you're familiar, I think probably most of you are, with some of the remarks, were really taken completely out of context in Transnistria and by the Russians. There's no talk of the ultimate unity of the two countries. It's not a practical discussion on any level. But talking that way doesn't help the situation because it provides fodder for the Transnistrians and for elements in Moldovan society that are anti-Romanian. So that would be very good if everyone stopped talking about that on that side, and on the other side that the Moldovans recognize the tremendous value that Romania can bring to their efforts. Did you want me to comment on the people that are lining up? And you wanted that too. Well, I mean, this is what is Moldova's greatest export at this point? Sadly, it's people. And Moldova is surviving as an economy based on the remittances that are coming from most people. The most frightening statistic is that Moldova's GDP now is lower than that of Sudan. That's an incredible statistic. You don't see that in Chisinau. Chisinau looks quite nice. Manicured lawns and, it's clean and people seem to be doing well, but that's because of those remittances. It's probably likely that Moldova will be exporting more people now via Romania. There's an article that I read just recently about Romania possibly becoming the Philippines of Europe. I think that's unlikely. I don't think that's really well thought out. But Moldova has, sadly, that possibility. And I think it's all wrapped up in this problem of Transnistria. We talk about Moldova has certain obligations of what it needs to do in order to make it more attractive. And there's certainly things they can do and aren't doing. But a lot of this problem is that 60% of its industry is controlled by another entity. And that's a terrible problem for a country that is basically in the Bessarabian section, is basically agrarian. And now with the pressure the Russians have placed on them on an embargo, which basically represents 80% of the agricultural output of Moldova, this is a tragedy. So we can all sit here and talk about what the Moldovans need to do and how they should do it, and we're all right, but we've got to get back to what resources do they have to do all this with?
Okay, there's a question right here.
Hello, my name is Sofia Gagachkova. I'm a master graduate student from Georgia. So my question is to Mr. Hill. You mentioned that development and reforms of Moldova will make it attractive to Transnistria, and that is the way out resolution toward the conflict. How do you imagine the development of Moldova when its economy is stuck because of the conflict zone there, plus to other problems, including difficult relations with Russia and ban on wines and other goods from Moldova, while the conflict zone itself becomes more self-sufficient, of course, with the huge help of Russia, and they have this feeling of being self-sufficient, especially in case of if they become officially independent. How do you see that? How it's possible to be a way out?
Don't sell Moldova short and don't overestimate Transnistria. They both suffer from the same economic ills. Transnistria is losing people just like Moldova. Their per capita GDP is perhaps a couple of more dollars per month higher than on the left bank than on the right bank. But that's not good. I mean, again, that's on Africa, sub-Saharan African levels. Now, part of it is that they don't pay taxes and don't tell people. And when you go around Chisinau, you see that it's actually there's more money coming in and around. But I would take a little bit of issue with what Mark Meyer said in the sense that yes, Moldova suffers because part of the industry that it had during the Soviet period has been taken by the Transnistrians and sold off, and it's deprived of that. But there has never been any ability of the Transnistrians or the Russians to block legislation adopted in the Moldovan parliament. There has never been any ability of Transnistria or the Russians to influence decisions taken in Moldovan courts. In other words, laws on foreign investment, campaigns against corruption, opening to business activity, the startup of new businesses, all of this is possible for the right bank, no matter whether the conflict is solved or not. You can see this in many, many fields. Moldova has the resources, for example, to have a media like Romania does. Doesn't have a media like Romania because investment is blocked. Monopolies are defended. And other regulations are enforced or not amended so as to allow the fertilization from outside influence and the talents within the country to develop. Now, the one thing that Moldova had from 1991 on was a highly educated population, basically a very capable labor force that if investment laws were conducive, a labor force that could have enabled the establishment of turnkey projects. Just bring a factory in of one sort or another, set it up, and you could find people to work in it. Because of impediments in legislation, regulations, and because of corruption, this hasn't happened. And what's happened is the capabilities of Moldova have eroded because the labor force has fled to Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Romania, Italy, Portugal, Spain, elsewhere in the world, and they send back money. The estimates for this year that I just saw in Moldovan news services is remittances will be approximately 1.3 billion. That's $1 billion back in. That's over a third of Moldova's GDP. This is how the country's... This can't go on. It will end sometime. And in the meantime, there are fewer people to work in the country. This is something that Transnistria suffers from also. And this is the paradox. Both sides suffer from this conflict going on. And each side has the power to start to correct it. I think the point is Moldova should think about becoming more attractive, not simply to solve the Transnistrian conflict. I mean, it's good for Moldova itself if you open to investment, to culture, to business, to trade, eliminate corruption. It's good for you. And then if the Transnistrians don't want to come along, let them sit there in their own swamp. And eventually they'll wise up, but at least Moldova will be better off. And this is, I think, I feel very strongly about this. The power ultimately to improve their own lives lies within the hands of my Moldovan friends, and we try to help. But they do have the opportunity to do this, and I hope they will take that opportunity and use it.
Bill, I don't disagree with a single thing you said. Not a single thing. In fact, in my opening remarks, I talked about the issues of corruption and how important it is to particularly clean up judicial corruption to make Moldova more attractive to small and medium-sized investors who are more likely to go to Moldova than large-scale investors. I guess where I may have been misunderstood is I think there is this whole problem of Transnistria is part of this problem. What do I mean? There are pernicious elites that operate in Moldova and in Transnistria, and those elites for a long time influenced through corrupt practices the policies of the Moldovan government. Now, I don't think it's quite the same thing anymore, but there is still that problem of the Transnistrian elite and its impact on business and political affairs within Moldova. And it's just part of the overall problem that Transnistria poses by this continued separatist movement. And the other thing is that if we are realistic, that it's small and medium-sized investors that will go to Romania and not the large investors into Moldova, I'm sorry, then, you know, I think we have to keep in mind that they're not going to do that while there is a separatist conflict underway. People, it's a big world, and there's no particular reason to go to Moldova if you feel that your money and your investment is at risk. And if it's at risk because there's a corrupt court system in which you cannot get a fair shake, that's one reason. If there could be, for some reason, some kind of an eruption of a civil war again, if there's any kind of possibility of physical violence that occurs, of those kind of issues, investors stay away. They go other places. So Transnistria is very much part of Moldova's problem, which does not deny a single thing that you said. Moldova could have done and should do now much more than it does in bringing the rule of law to a fore in the country.
We've just about run out of time, so I think we'll continue conversation at the wine reception in a moment, but I want to know if any of the speakers or our discussant would like to make any final remarks. Are we ready to move on? Well, then please let me thank the audience for coming, and in particular I'd like to thank Ambassador Kertvaka for coming to the Kennan Institute for the first time since he's begun his job here. The wine reception will be, as I said, across the hall. Please join me in thanking our speakers and our discussant for really a very provocative, interesting conversation.